Picture yourself standing in the middle of a bustling, dusty marketplace in the ancient Near East.
Oh, that's quite a scene to start with.
Right. The air is just thick with the smell of spices
Hmm.
and, livestock.
And probably a lot of unwashed bodies.
Yeah, definitely unwashed bodies. You are surrounded by merchants haggling, kids running around, animals making noise,
Just total chaos.
total chaos. But suddenly, someone walks right up to you and starts speaking.
Okay.
Only you have absolutely no idea what they're saying.
You don't know the language at all.
None. To your brain, they are not using verbs or nouns. They aren't like conveying an intricate thought.
It just sounds like noise.
Exactly. I mean, spot on. To your ear, it doesn't sound like communication. It's just babbling. Nonsense syllables strung together.
And that reaction, that visceral human instinct to hear an unknown language as meaningless babble, that's actually our starting point today.
It is. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to take an extensive look at a single, fascinating Hebrew root word.
The word is Letz, or sometimes it's spelled Letz.
Right, and we're going to trace its evolution into its most infamous noun form, letz, which ends up being one of the most terrifying concepts in the entire Hebrew Bible.
It really is. And to do this properly, to really unpack this, we have brought in a stack of primary sources.
Yeah, tell us what we're working with today.
Well, these function like historical linguistic detective tools. We are pulling directly from the heavyweights of Hebrew scholarship.
Or big ones.
Yeah, this includes the Gethenius Hebrew Chaldee Lexicon, the Brown Driver Briggs Lexicon, which most students just call BDB, and the Theological Wordbook of the Old Testament.
Which people usually abbreviate as TWOT.
Right, TWOT. Now, we recognize that sitting down to read ancient dictionaries and, technical concordances sounds like an incredibly dry exercise.
It sounds like homework.
It does. But the progression we're going to look at today is staggering. We're going to trace a word that starts out as a completely neutral, objective description of someone stammering in a foreign tongue.
Just a totally normal observation.
Yeah, but through centuries of linguistic mutation and theological development, that same root ends up functioning as the ultimate biblical description for the most hardened, cynical, unteachable human beings in existence.
It's a huge shift. And I want to make a quick pacing note here. We are going to take a very measured, structured approach today.
Right.
We want to ensure we give every single nuance the breathing room it requires. So we're going to try our best not to interrupt each other as we unpack these really dense lexical entries.
I agree. We will not be rushing this.
I am so glad we are taking our time because the stakes attached to this one word are massive. What we are really doing today is tracing a psychological profile.
We're watching an ancient culture observe human behavior and categorize it.
Right. So let's start right at the beginning of this word's life. According to those 19th century dictionaries, specifically Gesenius, what is the primary original meaning of the root Lutz?
Well, Gesenius points out that the primary origin of Lutz meant to stammer or to speak barbarously.
Speak barbarously.
Oh, yeah. It was originally a very practical observational term.
Yeah.
It was used to describe someone speaking a foreign tongue.
So no moral judgment attached.
None at all. Gesenius notes that this stems from a very specific idea. To those who are ignorant of a foreign language, the speaker appears as if they are babbling senselessly.
It's just an objective description of a communication breakdown.
Spot on. It is simply an acknowledgement that the gap between your language and my language is currently unbridgeable, and therefore you sound like you are just making noise.
That makes perfect sense. I think the easiest way for us to grasp that original concept is to look at a very famous historical parallel.
Oh, like the Greeks?
Yes, think about how the ancient Greeks coined the term barbarian.
Right.
When the Greeks encountered foreigners, specifically the Persians or other non-Greek speaking tribes, they did not understand the grammar or the vocabulary being used.
It was just noise to them.
Exactly. To the Greek ear, the foreign language just sounded like a repetitive string of nonsense syllables like bar, ba, bar, ba, ba.
Hence, barbarians.
Right. So they simply called those people barbarians, the people who babble. It perfectly captures that human tendency to hear an unknown language and process it not as intelligent thought, but as chaotic noise.
And the Hebrew root lutz operates on that exact same linguistic instinct. It captures the sound of a language you have not learned.
But I'm looking at our notes here, and there is a sudden radical shift. The word does not stay locked in that definition of mere babbling.
No, it goes through a grammatical change.
Right, something called a hipthil stem. Now, I have to admit, my ancient Hebrew grammar is a little rusty. What does shifting into that verb form actually do to the word?
So it changes the entire direction of the action. In Hebrew grammar, the hipfil stem is used to indicate a causative action.
Okay, so you are causing something to happen.
Exactly. So when the root Letz, which means to babble, moves into this causative form, it produces a specific noun. Malitz.
The malitz.
Yes. And the lexicons tell us that a malitz is an interpreter or an ambassador.
Oh, wow. So if Letz is the babbling, the malitz is the person causing the babbling to make sense.
You've got it. They are taking the chaotic, foreign noise and causing it to become understandable communication.
That is fascinating. Do we see that actually used in the text?
We do. We see this explicit usage in the book of Genesis, chapter 42, verse 23.
Ah, the Joseph narrative.
Yes. This is the moment in the text where Joseph's brothers have come down to Egypt seeking food during a massive famine.
And Joseph is essentially the prime minister of Egypt at this point, right?
Right. And he recognizes his brothers, but they do not recognize him. They think he is just a harsh foreign Egyptian ruler.
Such a tense moment.
It is. And the text gives us this brilliant little behind-the-scenes detail. It tells us that the brothers were speaking freely in front of Joseph, confessing their guilt about how they had treated him years ago.
Because they assume he only speaks Egyptian.
Exactly. They didn't realize Joseph could understand them because, as the text says, he was using a mulets, an interpreter, to speak with them.
That is such a cinematic detail. Joseph is standing there, perfectly understanding his native Hebrew. But to maintain his cover, he waits for the melets to take the Hebrew, translate it into Egyptian, and then he speaks Egyptian back.
And then the Melitz translates it into Hebrew for the brothers.
The interpreter is the bridge.
They really are. They are standing between two completely separate worlds, the desperate world of the Hebrew brothers and the powerful foreign world of the Egyptian court.
And they are making communication possible?
Precisely. The Melitz is a linguistic diplomat. They remove the barrier of the foreign tongue.
Which is huge for survival.
It is. And this establishes a crucial concept in the minds of the ancient Hebrews, the necessity of a mediator. Without the Melitz, there is no trade, there is no negotiation, there is no survival for those brothers.
There is only a wall of incomprehensible noise.
Yeah.
Wait, I have a thought here. If a Melitz functions to bridge the gap between two human languages, like between Hebrew and Egyptian, what happens when the biblical authors take this exact word and use it to describe a bridge between humans and God?
Oh, that's a massive question.
Because if God is holy, infinite, and entirely, other, his communication to a finite, flawed human being might seem just as foreign, if not terrifyingly overwhelming, as an Egyptian ruler speaking to a starving nomad.
That is a brilliant transition.
Yeah.
Because that question leads us directly into a major theological friction point documented right in the pages of our lexicons.
Really, a friction point in the dictionary.
Yes. The sources show us that Melitz is indeed used figuratively for intermediaries between God and man. BDB and Chesenius point us to passages like Job 33:23 and Isaiah 43:27.
Okay, so it shows up in Job and Isaiah.
Right. In these texts, the word describes an ambassador, a spokesman, or even an angelic figure who intercedes on behalf of human beings.
An angel acting as a Melitz.
Yes. Let's look at the context of Job. Elihu, one of Job's friends, is speaking. He describes a scenario where a person is suffering, drawing near to the pit, facing imminent death.
A pretty grim situation.
Very. But Elihu says that if there is an angel, a melitz, one of 1,000, to declare to man what is right and to be gracious to him, then the person is delivered.
Wow. So the text envisions a heavenly court scene.
Yes, where a celestial being functions as an advocate or a translator of God's will to a suffering human being on earth.
Okay, I have a massive question about this. I'm looking at the specific entry for Job 33:23 in the Gesenius lexicon.
I know exactly what you're going to point out.
Gesenius translates the phrase as an angel interceding with God on behalf of men. He even compares it to the concept of guardian angels mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew.
He does.
But then, right in the middle of his dictionary definition, he inserts this highly specific bracketed note.
It's very noticeable.
He writes, "This is strange theology. Christ is the one mediator and intercessor for his people." Why is a 19th century German lexicographer inserting his personal theological critique into a Hebrew dictionary? I mean, isn't he just dragging his own Protestant theology into a Bronze Age text?
It's a phenomenal question, and it highlights the challenge of reading these historical lexicons.
Because if the text in Job says an angel acts as an intercessor, why can't we let it say that? Why does he have to flag it as strange?
To understand his reaction, we really have to look at the theological framework these specific scholars are working from. These lexicons, particularly Gesenius, often lean heavily on Reformed theology.
Which is our background as well.
Right. As Protestant Christians, we adhere strictly to historical Protestant confessions, like the Westminster Confession.
And that confession has a very specific view on mediation.
It is completely unambiguous. It states that it pleased God to choose and ordain the Lord Jesus to be the singular mediator between God and man. The idea is solus Christus, Christ alone.
Okay, I see where this is going.
So, when Gesenius is parsing the Hebrew grammar of Job, and he sees the word melets applied to an angel securing grace for a human, his theological alarm bells ring.
It clashes with his understanding of the exclusivity of Christ's mediatorial work.
Exactly. He steps out of his objective academic role of defining syntax and openly critiques the theological implications of the text.
So he is basically saying, here's what the Hebrew says, but as a Protestant, I am very uncomfortable with it.
Essentially, yes. Our sources today view this through that specific theological lens. But if we want to reconcile the actual text of Job with that Reformed perspective, we have to think about the progress of redemptive history.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the lexicons provide the translation of spokesman or ambassador for these passages. In the context of Job, which is arguably one of the oldest books in the biblical canon, the human author is observing a heavenly court scene from a very early, ancient Near Eastern perspective.
They didn't have the New Testament yet?
Right. The concept of a celestial intermediary, someone to translate the terrifying holiness of God to frail humanity, was a category the ancient mind desperately needed.
That makes a lot of sense.
The friction exists because Gesenius is reading this ancient text backward, through the lens of the completed New Testament.
He has the answer key, essentially.
Right. He is looking back with the full light of the gospel, where the final perfect melets, the God-man Jesus Christ, has already been revealed.
So the author of Job had the shadow, but Gesenius is looking at the substance.
That's a great way to put it. From the perspective of the scholars who compiled these sources, the ancient text is not teaching a permanent system of angelic mediators. Rather, it is demonstrating humanity's desperate, inherent need for someone to stand in the gap.
They needed an ambassador who could speak both the language of heaven and the language of earth.
Yes, that longing for a melitz in Job 33 is what those scholars would argue is ultimately, or rather in the end, fulfilled in the person of Christ.
So, while Gesenius' instinct to protect the exclusivity of Christ makes perfect sense within his tradition, his shock at the text sort of fails to appreciate how the biblical narrative was establishing the very category of a mediator in the minds of the people.
Spot on. He misses the developmental aspect of the text.
That is fascinating. The melitz functions as a necessary life-saving bridge. It takes confusing, terrifying foreign communication and makes it understandable. It brings peace.
It does.
But looking at our outline, this root word Letz does not stay in the realm of diplomacy and mediation.
No, it takes a severe dark turn.
How on earth do we get from a word that means interpreter to a word that describes a hardened, malicious scoffer? I mean, a bridge connects people. A mocker destroys them. Where does the linguistic mutation happen?
The mutation happens in the intent behind the imitation.
The intent, okay.
Let's go back to the base action of the root, imitating a foreign sound. The lexicons detail the second branch of the root lux, which means to deride or to mock someone.
So still imitating, but for a different reason.
Right. Gesenius provides a psychological insight here. He suggests this mocking was probably done by imitating someone's voice in sport.
Oh, wow. Like making fun of how they sound?
Yes. The linguistic connections provided in the sources back this up. They link the Hebrew root to the Sanskrit word lad.
Okay.
And the Latin word lude, which relates to playing or mocking, and the Greek word last, meaning derision.
So across all these languages, the core idea is there.
Yes. The physical act is still mimicking, but the motive has entirely shifted from translation to destruction.
Okay, I think I have the perfect modern analogy for this.
Let's hear it.
Think about the modern internet troll.
Oh, that is good.
Right. An internet troll rarely engages with the actual substance of a well-reasoned argument. If you post a detailed, earnest explanation of a topic online, The troll does not meet you with contrary facts.
They rarely care about the facts.
No, they attack your tone. They make a meme portraying you as a crying face. They mock your earnestness. They take your words and repeat them back in a sarcastic, alternating caps lock font.
Which is literally imitating the voice to mock them.
Exactly. That is exactly what this root word is capturing. What begins as simply mimicking a sound, just like mimicking the bar 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 of a foreign language, mutates into a weapon of insult.
It's insidious.
The imitation is designed to belittle, to strip the original speaker of their dignity, and to turn their earnest communication into a joke. It is intellectual vandalism.
That analogy is spot on. The internet troll is the modern incarnation of this exact behavioral pattern. They use imitation not to build a bridge, but to burn one down.
Do we see this action in the biblical text?
We do. We can see this specific, malicious action recorded in several passages provided by our lexicons. In Psalm 119, verse 51, the psalmist cries out that the arrogant utterly deride him, yet he does not turn away from God's law.
So the arrogants are acting as trolls against his devotion.
Yes. In Proverbs 19, verse 28, the text describes a worthless witness who mocks at justice.
So the imitation has become a tool of subversion in the legal system itself.
It corrupts the whole process.
Now, I am looking at another example from the sources, Proverbs chapter 3, verse 34, and this one stops me in my tracks because God himself is actually the subject of the verb.
That is a very difficult text.
The text says that God mocks or scoffs at the scorners while giving grace to the humble. What does that even mean? How can a holy God engage in the very action he condemns?
That is a staggering paradox in the wisdom literature. When the text says God scoffs at the scorners, it is describing a divine reversal.
A reversal?
Yes. It is not that God is acting like a petty internet troll. It is that God allows the mockery of the wicked to collapse in on itself.
Oh, I see.
The scoffer build their entire worldview on the premise that they are smarter than God. The divine justice is a joke. God's mockery is the objective reality of the universe laughing at their delusion.
It's the universe proving them wrong.
Right. It is the moment their arrogant, mocking fortress crumbles, revealing how small and foolish they actually are. It shows the sheer severity of this action. Human mocking is met with divine derision. And it is from this continuous, hardened action of mocking that the Hebrew language creates its most famous derivative of the root, the noun letz, which translates to the scoffer, the mocker, or the babbler.
So as we move into the wisdom literature of the Bible books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, something highly significant happens. The word stops being just a verb.
It stops being a description of a single action.
Yes, it crystallizes into a noun. It becomes an identity. The text starts talking about the Letz as a specific category of human being.
It's a complete profile.
So what is going on in the mind of the Letz? Why do they do what they do?
To understand the psychology of the Letz, we have to rely on the stark definition provided in our sources. Gesenius defines the Letz as a frivolous and impudent person who despises scoffingly the most sacred precepts of religion, piety, and morals.
Despises scoffingly. That is a heavy phrase.
It is.
Yeah.
We are not talking about someone who is simply ignorant. We're not talking about a teenager asking skeptical questions because they genuinely want to know the truth.
Right. Honest doubt is different.
Very different. The Letz is someone who has made a settled, deliberate, hostile choice to treat that which is holy with absolute contempt. It is a posture of aggressive arrogance.
They've dug their heels in.
Yes. In wisdom literature, humanity is often divided into categories. You have the wise, the simple or naive, the fool, and finally the scoffer.
And the scoffer represents the absolute bottom of that moral descent.
The rock bottom.
It is the point of no return. Our sources provide a list of attributes from the book of Proverbs that build a full psychological profile of this individual. Let's unpack these.
Okay, let's go through them.
First, Proverbs 21:24 states that the proud and haughty man is named a scoffer. He acts with arrogant pride. So pride is the foundational soil that the Letz grows in.
Yes. The pride of the Letz is an illusion of self-sufficiency. They believe their intellect is the ultimate standard of the universe.
They think they know better than everyone else.
Absolutely.
Second, they do not just happen to mock, they actively delight in their scorning. Proverbs 1, verse 22 asks how long the scoffers will delight in their scoffing. They get a dopamine hit from tearing down truth.
They do. It brings them a perverse joy to make other people look foolish.
Why is that?
That delight is the hallmark of cynicism. Cynicism is incredibly seductive because it makes you feel superior without requiring you to actually build anything of value.
It's so much easier to tear things down.
It is much easier to throw stones at a house than to build one. The Letz delights in throwing stones.
Third, and this seems to be their defining characteristic, they are completely unteachable. They hate being corrected.
This is a major theme.
Proverbs 9 verse 7 warns that whoever corrects a scoffer gets himself abuse. Proverbs 9 verse 8 explicitly commands, "Do not reprove a scoffer or he will hate you."
It's very clear warning.
And Proverbs 15 verse 12 says, "A scoffer does not like to be reproved. He will not go to the wise." So why is their reaction to correction so violently defensive?
This is where we have to look at the psychological mechanisms at play, which our Reformed sources would categorize under the doctrine of total depravity.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. In that theological framework, total depravity does not mean a person is as cartoonishly evil as possible. It means that the corruption of sin extends to every single faculty of human nature, including the mind and the intellect.
So their thinking itself is corrupted.
Yes. The poor Letz is the textbook example of what the Apostle Paul would later describe as the unregenerate mind, a mind that is hostile to God and cannot submit to his law.
But they're often very smart, right?
Oh, absolutely. The scoffer's intellect is not broken in the sense that they cannot perform mathematical equations or logic puzzles. It is broken in its orientation. It is entirely closed off to divine instruction.
I see.
When you correct a Letz, you are introducing cognitive dissonance. You are threatening the illusion of their supremacy. Their violent, mocking reaction is a defense mechanism.
They deploy mockery as a shield to keep conviction at bay.
That's right. They use their intellect not to discover truth, but to construct a fortress of derision to protect their autonomy.
That explains the fourth attribute beautifully. Because of this hardened defensive posture, they cannot find wisdom even if they make a pretense of looking for it.
They're locked out.
Proverbs 14, verse 6 tells us that a scoffer seeks wisdom in vain, but knowledge is easy for a man of understanding. The millets might engage in a debate, they might ask philosophical questions, but they will never find the truth because their starting premise is that they already know better than the person they are asking.
Precisely. They are asking questions not to learn, but to trap.
We see this dynamic constantly in modern discourse.
Oh, all the time. Someone engages in a conversation supposedly seeking answers, but their tone is dripping with condescension. The biblical authors diagnosed this thousands of years ago. The Letz is trapped in an echo chamber of their own arrogance.
I want to look at how the ancient translators handled this word because I think it expands our understanding of just how damaging this kind of person was considered to be in a community.
The Greek translations are really revealing here.
They are. The lexicons provide us with the Septuagint equivalents. For our listeners who might not be familiar, the Septuagint, often abbreviated as LXX, is the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. It was created by Jewish scholars a few centuries before Christ.
Right.
Looking at the Greek words those ancient scholars chose to translate the Hebrew word letz is incredibly revealing. They didn't just pick one Greek word, they used a variety of words depending on the context. One of the words they used is loimos. What does that mean?
Loimos literally translates to a pest or a plague.
A plague.
Yeah, it is a biological term for a contagious disease.
A biological term. That is wild. They are taking a behavioral descriptor and mapping it onto epidemiology.
It implies that the ancient translators understood something vital about human sociology. The scoffer is not just an isolated problem. Their mockery is highly infectious.
Like a virus.
Exactly. Cynicism spreads through a community like a virus. If you allow a Letz to sit in your council, their derisive attitude will slowly infect the naive and the inexperienced around them. It is destructive to the health of the entire social body.
Another Greek word they used is akolastos, which means undisciplined or incorrigible. It paints a picture of a horse that refuses to be broken, someone who rejects any external authority or moral framework.
They won't be governed.
Right. They also used kakous, the standard word for bad or evil, and hyperephanos, meaning arrogant or showing oneself above others. When you compile that Greek vocabulary plate, undisciplined, evil, arrogant, you realize that the Letz is an absolute menace.
They're a destructive force tearing at the fabric of society. They're the anti-community. They dissolve social trust.
That naturally leads us to a very practical dilemma. If you are living in an ancient community or even a modern one, and you have a walking plague of pride in your midst, someone who delights in tearing down truth and uses their intellect purely for mockery, how does the biblical text instruct you to deal with them?
Well, the biblical prescription for dealing with the Letz is incredibly severe.
How severe?
It is severe precisely because their condition is so entrenched. The lexicons outline the specific actions taken against the scoffer in the source texts, and we see a deliberate progression of isolation and judgment.
Okay, what's the first step?
First, the text establishes their objective standing before God and man. Proverbs 24 verse 9 declares that the scoffer is an abomination to mankind.
An abomination.
The underlying Hebrew conveys a visceral sense of deep disgust. Their posture of relentless mockery makes them repulsive to healthy human flourishing. People naturally recoil from them over time.
Second, the Psalms instruct the righteous to avoid them completely. The very first verse of the entire Psalter, Psalm 1, verse 1, establishes the baseline for a blessed life.
It's a famous passage.
It is. It says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers." I love the physical progression in that verse.
The downward spiral.
Right. You start by walking alongside bad advice. Then you stop and stand in the path of habitual sinners. But the final destination, the absolute bottom of the spiral, is pulling up a chair and sitting in the seat of the scoffer.
Because sitting represents permanence.
Yes, it represents taking up residence in a posture of mockery. The instruction is clear. Do not sit at that table.
And third, when a scoffer infiltrates a community, the text commands decisive removal. Proverbs 22 verse 10 says, "Drive out a scoffer, and strife will go out, and quarreling and abuse will cease."
Notice the cause and effect there.
The text explicitly links the presence of the affiliates to continuous exhausting contention. Because they are a plague, as the Greek translation noted, the only cure for the community is quarantine. They must be banished.
You can't just talk them out of it.
You cannot reason them into compliance. You cannot hug them into submission. You have to remove them.
Okay, that command to banish the scoffer brings up a major question for me, based on another text provided in our sources.
Which one?
Proverbs chapter 19, verse 25 says, "Strike a scoffer, and the simple will learn prudence." The lexicon notes that the scoffer is smitten and punished for the benefit of the simple.
Right.
When I read that, it sounds like public discipline. But here's my question about the mechanics of this discipline. When the community or the authorities strike or punish the scoffer, does that punishment actually fix the scoffer? Is the goal rehabilitation? Or is the punishment purely a spectator sport, a violent visual aid designed solely for the benefit of the onlookers?
If we look closely at the lexical data and the precise wording of the Hebrew text, the answer is quite sobering. The text explicitly states that the punishment of the scoffer is enacted so that the simple, the Hebrew word is the piety, learn a lesson.
So it's for the petty, not the Letz.
Yes. We have to understand the taxonomy of characters in Proverbs. The petty is the naive person. They are the impressionable, inexperienced youth who is standing at a moral crossroads. Their character is not yet formed. They are malleable.
But the Letz is different.
The Letz has already solidified like concrete. The physical strike against the scoffer is not expected to break through their hardened exterior to produce repentance.
So it really is a visual aid.
Yes. They are largely beyond reaching through normal corrective means. This is why Proverbs 19 verse 29, just 4 verses later, says that condemnation is ready for scoffers and beating for the backs of fools.
The judgment is already locked in.
The judgment is prepared because their posture is fixed. The punishment serves as a deterrent to the naive observer. It is actually an act of grace to the petit.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it. Grace for the observer.
The community is letting the naive youth see the painful public consequences of the violence, warning them to turn back before they too become unteachable. The scoffer becomes a cautionary tale.
That concept of isolating and judging the scoffer carried massive historical weight long after the Old Testament was written. Our sources point out that this exact vocabulary continued to shape communities for centuries.
It absolutely did.
Let's talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls for a moment. The Dead Sea Scrolls Study Edition notes the frequent appearance of the root Letz in the documents found at Qumran. What is the context there?
The Qumran community was a sect of strict, observant Jews who lived out in the desert by the Dead Sea around the time of Christ. They saw themselves as the righteous remnant.
And they had a problem with the establishment in Jerusalem,
A
right?
huge problem. They believed the religious establishment in Jerusalem, the priests operating in the temple, had become entirely corrupt. And the primary label they applied to those corrupt priests, the rebels, and their opponents was this very word. They called them the Letz, the mockers.
So they literally enacted the command of Proverbs 22, verse 10. They saw the establishment as a plague of mockers, and instead of trying to fix them, the Qumran community drove themselves out into the desert.
They self-isolated.
They isolated themselves to avoid the contention of the wider society. It shows how deeply this word permeated the Jewish consciousness. To be called a Letz was the ultimate identifier of someone who had completely abandoned the covenant.
It was the worst possible label you could assign to an adversary. But what is truly remarkable about the biblical writers is their poetic creativity.
How so?
Well, while the frivolous is almost exclusively a human being, a specific type of hardened person, the writers of Scripture also applied this label to an inanimate object. This brings us to one of the most striking metaphors in our lexicons.
Yes, I want to look at this closely. The metaphor is found in Proverbs 20, verse 1, which states, "Wine is a mocker, strong drink, a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise."
Right.
The lexicons point out that the text literally says wine is a Letz. They personify the chemical substance. Let's break down the mechanics of this metaphor. How does fermented grape juice earn the title of the hardened, unteachable scoffer?
It is brilliant in its psychological and physiological accuracy. The writer is personifying the substance by describing the behavioral output of the person who consumes it.
Okay, so it's about the effect.
Let's look at what alcohol actually does to the human brain. When someone becomes intoxicated, their frontal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for judgment, restraint, and social filters, is suppressed.
Their guard comes down.
As a result, the wine takes on the exact characteristics of the impudent, haughty, undisciplined mocker we have been discussing. What does a person do when they have had too much to drink? They lose their inhibitions. They become loud. They begin to babble.
Which brings us all the way back to the original root meaning of Letz, speaking senseless, unintelligible syllables.
Full circle.
The drunk person starts slurring their words, babbling like a foreigner.
Exactly. The cycle repeats. But it goes further than just slurred speech. Intoxicated people often become belligerent and derisive. They mock. They scoff. They despise correction.
That is so true.
Think about trying to tell an intoxicated person that they have had enough to drink and it is time to give you their car keys. How do they usually respond?
With extreme defensiveness. They roll their eyes, they mock you, they tell you they are perfectly fine, they get aggressive. They exhibit the exact haughty, unteachable arrogance of the Letzels.
Precisely. The proverb is warning that consuming the substance effectively downloads the persona of the scoffer right into your own mind and body.
It's like you swallow the attitude.
The wine bypasses your moral defenses and makes you an active participant in the community of the dialects. It is a chemical shortcut to becoming the very thing the wisdom literature warns you to avoid.
That personification is so vivid, it perfectly ties the physical act of babbling back to the moral act of mocking. And that brings us to a final related word from our sources. It is another noun derivative of the root Letz, and it shows how this posture of mockery is actually weaponized in culture.
This is a really vital piece of the puzzle.
The lexicons introduce the word melitza. According to BDB and TWOT, this word means a satire, a mocking poem, or an enigma and figure.
This is where the behavior of the Letz becomes formalized. It is used in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 6, to describe the taunt songs that the oppressed people will take up against the corrupt, violent Chaldeans.
A taunt song.
Yeah. It is also used in Proverbs 1, verse 6, to describe the complex sayings, riddles, or dark figures of speech of the wise.
So the Letz does not just mock in spontaneous playground outbursts. They are not just drunk people babbling at a bar. They actually formalize their derision.
They put it in writing?
They write poetry. They craft satire. They use the arts, literature, and media to institutionalize their contempt for God's laws. It is a highly intellectualized form of rebellion. They write the melitza.
That is the tragedy of the unregenerate intellect.
Yeah.
It allows us to synthesize how all of these disparate definitions tie together into one cohesive linguistic evolution.
It really is an incredible arc.
We have watched this root word, Letz, begin as an objective description of foreign babbling, a neutral communication barrier. We saw it evolve through the hip to stem into the noble concept of interpreting and mediating the mullets who causes the babbling to make sense.
The one who bridges the gap between hostile parties.
Anticipating the desperate need for a mediator between a holy God and finite man.
But then the root took that dark turn. The imitation of the voice was used not to translate, but to mimic, mock, and deride.
It became destructive.
And that action hardened into a permanent title, the Letz. The the scoffer who is fundamentally unteachable, heavily infected with pride, and hostile to divine wisdom. And finally, that hardened scoffer produces the melitza, the mocking poem, using their considerable intellect to spread their contagion to the rest of society.
It is a complete, devastating portrait of the fall of the human mind. The intellect, originally designed to interpret God's world and mediate his truth, is twisted into an instrument of arrogant derision.
It's tragic.
And from the Reformed theological perspective of our sources, this entirely reinforces their understanding of the human condition. The Letz cannot cure themselves. You cannot reason with a scoffer because their reason is entirely captive to their pride.
The disease is just too entrenched.
They require an outside intervention. They need the true Letz, the mediator, Jesus Christ, as Gesenius pointed out in his lexicon, to break through that hardened exterior. The sources argue that only a divine mediator can replace the heart of stone with a heart of flesh and translate the grace of God into a language that a rebellious, mocking soul can finally receive and understand.
That brings the entire discussion full circle. We have traveled from the objective difficulty of foreign tongues in an ancient marketplace, all the way to the tragic, prideful posture of the unteachable scoffer, and finally to the theological necessity of a singular mediator to bridge the gap we could never cross ourselves.
It just goes to show that ancient dictionaries are not just static lists of dead words.
They really aren't. They are living records of humanity's deepest flaws and greatest needs. Before we sign off today, I want to leave you with a final thought to consider on your own.
Always good to end with some self-reflection.
We have spent this entire deep dive talking extensively about the Letz as if they are always someone else. It is easy to point at the arrogant person over there, the internet troll, the plague in the community, the rebel.
Very easy.
But if the definitive trait of the scorner is an absolute defensive refusal to accept correction or reproof, in what subtle ways do you notice that defensive, mocking posture creeping into your own responses when someone points out a flaw in you?
That's a tough question.
It is easy to identify the scoffer in a crowd, but it is much harder to spot the beginnings of that babbling derision in our own hearts. Next time you feel the urge to mock a valid critique, remember the trajectory of the Letz. Until next time, keep thinking.